part of my underwhelm with Sunday services is just that I'm, not that far down the spiritual path, but I'm not 25 anymore. And sitting through a sermon series on whatever is not as life-changing for me at this point in my journey as it was at that point in my journey. I'm a little bit less emotion-driven now at this point. The problems I'm facing in my, sin that's in my body are much deeper and are not solved by information and inspiration for the most part. I'm way too messed up for that. And it's a much, much deeper stuff that Jesus is working on in me now. And then I think part of it, and this is embarrassing, but there is just the American consumer mentality that is the air we breathe. It's like breathing secondhand smoke. I can't help but imbibe the consumerism of our culture. And in a TED Talk, internet-based podcast world, unless if your local preacher is John Tyson or, a couple of years, not that long ago, Tim Keller, it's pretty hard to not be a little bit bored.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. So glad to have you join us. If you're new, make sure you subscribe. And today, I'm going to sit down in Los Angeles with Mark Comer, and we talk about all things discipleship, why the weekend service isn't delivering what it used to, what he's thinking about in discipleship these days, what's behind practicing the way, his new book, his new message, and a whole lot more. Hey, if you haven't got my 2024 Church Trends Guide for Leaders, make sure you pick it up. This is part 5 of the Church Trends series on my podcast, and we're going to go deep in discipleship, but I've got a lot more for you there at 2024churchtrends.com, or just click the link below that you see. And then also make sure you check out our partner Subsplash. We talk about digital discipleship in the Church Trends this year. And if you're not doing hybrid church, well, you're probably not going to reach the people that you could reach. To get started with 16,000 churches who use Subsplash, go to subsplash.com/Carey, and you can get up to $500 off, a $500 credit when you sign up today. So check it out. Again, click the link. And now to today's episode with Mark Comer. Well, Mark, it's good to be hanging out. Welcome back.
It is always great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, and fun to finally do this in person. So Thanks for having me to your home.
It's weird when you feel like you know somebody, but you've never actually been embodied with them. So
100%.
Here we are. First time.
So last time we talked about this over lunch briefly, you were on. I just had so much feedback on the processing you and I did about what it's like to no longer be the lead pastor. We don't have to rehash that. People can go back to
processing my freely chosen midlife crisis.
It was very healing and therapeutic for me, but I want to know if you've had any other light bulbs. Like, you've moved since then, so you're in the LA area now. How's the processing going from hey, this is who I used to be, to this is who I am now?
Oh man, I don't know how to summarize that. I think I'm still very much in the liminal space in the world of, in the language of psychology, of that in-between. I'm not where I was, but I'm not where I'm going yet. And so the deck is still getting kind of reshuffled in really good ways. I think I'm through the most painful kind of stripping away of, attachments and stuff like that. And I think now, there's just been a lot gets exposed. One of the really dangerous tricks, I think, when it comes to pastoring is probably more than almost any other job in the world. It is so easy to do the right thing for all the wrong reasons.
Yes.
I mean, you can, preach the gospel of Jesus and teach the Bible and start churches and call people to discipleship. And actually, your motivational structure can be deeply skewed, which is why you have these people that have blown up their pastoral ministries, not for lack of emphasis on Jesus or lack of commitment to orthodoxy and the teaching of Scripture or lack of discipleship, but through more than just emotional unhealth, through clearly an underlying ambition and ego-driven kind of motivational structure. So, the pain and the gift of stepping down is all of that stuff is exposed. And so now that I have a relationship to church that has no tie to my career, my job, my income, how many books I sell, whatever, my sense of self, it's just, that's gone. And then, the kind of bare naked truth of my motivational structure is exposed. For years, we all love to read Paul and just say, I am just a servant of the church. And that sounds like a beautiful platitude, but you never really know if that's true until it's tested. And I think in my case, and I would imagine this is true of most people, I'm likely a little bit worse than most, but not that much. My motives were mixed at best. And I don't say that in a masochistic way or any kind of guilt or shame. I think just in an honest, I want Jesus to continue to give me the heart of a servant. And if I'm anything like the disciples in the 4 Gospels, that is a long, slow process. Because at the very end, he's still saying to them, the greatest among you shall be your servant. And one of his last teaching lessons is the washing of feet. And I have set you an example. And man, my heart is so far from that servant heart of Jesus. But I think it's a process. And but it's been really good. It's stirred up a lot. It's got me thinking a lot about the church. I feel like there are things and perspectives on the church that are much easier to access when your career is not tied to it. And so I'm actually thinking probably more about the church right now than I have in years. And I find it really stimulating.
Yeah, what are you thinking about the church now? You're right, because I'm still connected to the church. I founded, I teach there very, very occasionally, but I am thinking about the church a lot. What are you noticing about the church that maybe you didn't notice 2 years ago when you were still a lead pastor?
I think I'm just continuing to develop some of the thinking that has been in my work, and if you want to call it a philosophy of ministry, for a number of years now. I think, without rehashing my whole pastoral life, I was reflecting the other day on my early kind of draw. This would have been, 15 years ago, more to what became the missional movement. And I remember reading The Shaping of Things to Come by Alan Hirsch and Michael Frost, which I think every megachurch pastor should read that book, even though it offers pretty much no solution to the problem, but it's a really good critique of what they would call the attractional church. And I was so drawn to that, growing up in very Sunday-centric large churches and then planting a Sunday-centric large church. I think I got access earlier than most because of just kind of how fast the church grew and how young I was, to the weakness of that model. And I'm not there is a model of church. I think I love Keller's idea of the gospel ecosystem, that every city needs different sizes of churches. It needs mega churches and community churches and house churches and neo-monastic communities and Shane Claiborne off doing his thing with, recycling whatever. And it needs mercy ministries and nonprofits and seminaries and training institutions, and they all work together. My lament is not so much that we have these larger Sunday-centric preaching-based churches or preaching and singing-based churches. It's that is the dominant model. And so many people are all trying to do the same model of church. And I think every model has pros and cons. And I think where pastors get into trouble is they're just not honest about the shadow side of their model. I had work with an executive coach who does a bunch of kind of Jungian, light and shadow, ego and shadow kind of work. They're really helpful for me. But he introduced me to an idea that is so simple, and I still can't get out of my head. And the theory is that basically in the same way that people have in Jung's concept like an ego, which is the self that you kind of project to the world, and not just in an image management sense. It's often the self we genuinely believe that we are and want to be and aspire to be, but it's not actually who we are. So then we create what, Jung called the shadow, which in his framework isn't so much like the shadow in Enneagram theory where it's all bad. Jung famously said 90% of the shadow is pure gold. I don't know if I agree with that, but by the shadow, he means, all the parts of us that we are unaware of or we refuse to acknowledge. And I think the reason it's so tied to sin is because so much sin comes out of that. In a pastoral example, when a pastor, let's just say the pastor is a man, lead pastor is a man, has, unhealed father wounds. The percentage of highly successful men that have horrible relationships with their dad is staggering. It's so far beyond the population, dispersion of the general bell curve. And so that unhealed wound often drives us to do really meaningful things, but then that very thing that made us successful can turn us into a failure. So if you're not aware of that and in tune with it and giving attention to it with Christ and community, then that shadow is often where sin comes out of, and that's just one common trope almost. So I think the new idea for me was that in the same way that people have an ego and a shadow, organizations have an ego and a shadow.
Oh, wow.
And so this was so helpful for me. I was introduced to this idea when I was at Bridgetown, and I had our elders and our staff all spend several hours trying to pray and reflect and discern what's the shadow of our organization and the shadow of our church. We know what the ego is. Go to our website. Here's our vision. Here's our branding. Here's our mission statement. Here's our strategy. Here's our preaching. But what's our shadow? And so I think the danger, back to thinking about church, when pastors lack an honesty, and often, we feel this pressure to kind of sell our model of church, which I think we need to curb that enthusiasm. But often when we don't acknowledge the shadow or the cons to our model, that's a major problem. And I don't think there is a model of church or a size of church. I have convictions that I think would make me really uncomfortable in certain models of church and much happier in others. But my basic contention is I think we need more models of church, a larger pastoral imagination beyond just mega churches and house churches or whatever. And I continue to believe that because my beating heart is for formation, community, the relational transformation of the soul into people of love like Jesus, my conviction based on all sorts of data and research is that primarily happens relationally through smaller contexts. And so, there's lots of different theories. Dunbar's is the one I use, who kind of uses the 4 levels of community based on grouping size. And his first 2 layers are your 1 to 5 intimates, which is part of the tragedy of loneliness, because, most Americans have no intimates right now. It's just like a new historical phenomenon. This would be your wife if you're married, or your spouse, or your therapist, or your best friend, or your 2 buddies from college that you've been with for 20 years. It's the people that actually know you as you are, and they know your shadow. The next round would be Dunbar's theory, it's about 12 to 15. Other people put the number as high as 30, but it's your friends. This is your community, the people you do the one another's of the New Testament with, your life. You do life together around a table with. Then he's famous for his 150 number, which is the,
So that's where you max out.
Yes. And at that point, at a church level, once a church goes over 150, the group psychology changes from kind of community to crowd. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because then there's this 4th layer of you can call it whatever you want. I like the word tribe in the positive sense. It's really meaningful and important to feel like you're a part of a larger body of people that has this vision and mission and values and ethos and culture. And all 4 levels are important, but it's those first 2 levels, your 1 to 5 intimates and your 12 to 15 or so friends, where based on what my understanding, the deepest levels of growth, healing, change, transformation all happen in those 2 spaces. So I think the older I get, I've just been on the same trajectory of I'm less and less, I am underwhelmed by Sunday services, even though I still have a high theology of preaching, but I am just very underwhelmed by them. And I am more and more with every passing year, and not as a theoretician, as a practitioner, and I'm very far past the honeymoon stage. I know how hard it is, but I am more and more convinced that the future of the church is smaller. It's around tables, not stages. It's relational, it's formational, it's prayer-based. And I think those convictions, now being on the receiving end of the church, and not having my ego tied in with that Sunday service, because as a general rule, pastors all want bigger churches and people all want smaller ones. And that's not true across the board, because often there are things that come with larger churches that people really want. But I think as a general rule, that's true. And having my kind of job disconnected from that has been really good for me to kind of, I think, open my mind to maybe more honestly consider.
What is underwhelming about Sundays? Because I think there's something about that. And I've noticed the older I get, John Mark, it's kind of like if I put all my happiness, so Dunbar's number, really interesting theory. And I think this is, Tim Keller used to write about this, but I think it comes from a Jewish theologian. With the death of the church, the death of God in our culture. It's sort of, if you look at the Instagram wedding, I mean, when I got married, our wedding wasn't that expensive. It wasn't this big production. We had a photographer, but it was kind of a specialized, but not a boilerplate wedding, but there just wasn't all the pressure. Now you've got I read the other day, bachelor parties now cost on average, I think it's $10,000 or $15,000 for the bachelor party, plus the wedding, plus it has to be Instagram perfect, plus, and the theology under that, as Keller would say, is your wedding and your spouse is not designed to bear that. You need to worship God. Your relationship has to be bigger than that. But the pageantry and the ceremony of what used to be church and majesty and God and life and right order is now
has gone into
your relationship. And no wonder people crumble under that. Yeah. I wonder if we've done a similar thing with Sunday services. If you think about all the freight that Sunday morning has to bear. If it really is, okay, I read my Bible for 5 minutes a day, said a quick prayer while I was driving to work, and now I'm going to Sunday, which I only catch once or twice a month anyway, by the way. Is it that, or what else is underwhelming about Sunday morning?
I think some of it is stage-based. So this is really probably unwise to talk about theories.
We can cut it or we can go.
On a podcast, I will let you decide if it's helpful or not. And I just, I'm pretty sensitive to people that critique based on theory but don't offer solutions that are as good or better.
I mean, we're not sitting back going at other people. So,
right. Yeah. And I'm not saying, throw away your Sunday gatherings.
Yeah.
What I've been saying about Sunday gatherings is nothing new. I've been saying it for many years. But I think some of it is stage-based. So I'm really interested in what in the secular world would be called developmental psychology, what Christians would call stage theory. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's a polarizing concept. Are there stages to spiritual formation, to Christian development over time? And how do they map onto or sync up with just the natural human life stages of adulthood and adolescence and midlife and old age? And so some people are really resistant to any attempt at spiritual cartography to kind of map the spiritual journey. I think with all sorts of disclaimers, I'm generally a fan because I just think anything that aids self-awareness, whether it's a personality theory like the Myers-Briggs or a stage theory about where you're at in life, anything that is helpful to get at access to our shadow, I think is helpful in the spiritual journey. It's helpful to open up deeper and deeper places of us to grace. And that in my meta level, 30,000 foot, that's basically my view of formation is the central question of discipleship is how do we open up deeper and deeper parts of ourselves to the work of the Holy Spirit, to grace, to transformation, because we can't do it. So how do we open up the broken parts of ourselves, the wounded parts of ourselves to Him? So I think stage theory is really interesting to me. There's a bunch of different great ones. They're all theories. None of them are capital T truth. None of them are chapter and verse. None of them are empirically verifiable. But there's a lot that I think ring pretty true. And there's one I really like out of Fuller Seminary, The Critical Journey. I would imagine you're familiar with that.
No, I don't know that.
Professors Janet Hagberg, I think, and Michael Gulick. So there is a book. It's called The Critical Journey. I did a teaching on it many years ago. You can find, that's a popular version of it. And they basically break the spiritual journey into 6 stages. We don't need to go through those. But at the end, they argue that these stages are not inevitable, that most Christians in America never mature beyond stage 3. So the first 3 stages are, stage 1 is, they call it recognition of God. Ancient Christians would call it awakening. Evangelicals would call it getting saved. Stage 2, they call the life of discipleship. They don't mean discipleship as I would use that word, but they mean like basic kind of discipleship to Jesus, learning to read your Bible, go to church, be in a small group, learning basic Christian doctrine. And then stage 3 is what they call the productive life. So you do things for Jesus now. You lead a small group, or you lead a missions team, or you join the board at your church, or you become a deacon, or you become a youth pastor, or you're doing something, or you're taking your work seriously as a follower of Jesus. All beautiful things. But that's just the first half of the spiritual journey. All that to say, I think that Sunday-based churches are pretty helpful for people in those first 3 stages.
Yep.
and increasingly unhelpful after that, which is why you have this tragic phenomenon where a lot of the people that have the deepest appetite for psychospiritual development, they want to psychologically mature and they want to spiritually mature. Often the enemy is at work in all of our hearts, feel the need, let's just set aside whether it's legitimate or wildly illegitimate, feel the need to step out of Sunday-based churches and almost graduate from that in order to continue the spiritual journey. And I think their blame can be placed on both sides. On one hand, you could say that's just narcissism eating you up now that you're not getting what you used to when you were 24 and you're hearing a sermon series or whatever, and you're like, oh my gosh, I never had any idea. Now you're 44 and you're like, I've heard this sermon series 9 times and it's not helping me fix my
and I've led this group
wayward teenager
10 years.
Or my broken marriage or my addiction to whatever or my pain from my childhood. And so then they move on, which is often just a way to deepen narcissism. I'm not saying it's wrong always to do that, but rather than liberate your heart from it. But on the church side, most churches often offer no discipleship pathway past that third stage. So it's basically, most churches do evangelism pretty well. They do basic discipleship pretty well. And then they invite people into leadership. Lead a small group, volunteer, lead this team, do our thing. And then that's where the vision of human maturity, spiritual maturity tends to end. And so I think a good thought exercise for pastors is imagine all of your core leaders. Like at Bridgetown, we had about 150 people. We had a lot of really good core leaders that were all leading home communities for us, leading ministries, on staff, in eldership, on our board of directors. I think a great question to ask is and Tyler Staton just did this recently with a group of leaders, what's your vision for them 10 years from now? What's your dream? If they stay in leadership at not your community, but the community you serve and shepherd, what's your dream? What's your vision? And is there any intentional pathway to see that vision become a reality for them 10, 15, 20 years from now? Or is it just, I need them to lead, and by leading, they will grow? And the reality is, by leading, they may grow. Leadership, I think, offers us access to our shadow. It exposes all the things that are wrong with us. So it gives us the chance to grow. But leadership may just as well mess people up. A lot of people lead and they just get bitter, cynical, burned out, turned off. So it's not like a surefire recipe. So I think part of my underwhelm with Sunday services is just that I'm, not that far down the spiritual path, but I'm not 25 anymore. And sitting through a sermon series on whatever is not as life-changing for me at this point in my journey as it was at that point in my journey. I'm a little bit less emotion-driven now at this point. The problems I'm facing in my, sin that's in my body are much deeper and are not solved by information and inspiration for the most part. I'm way too messed up for that. And it's a much, much deeper stuff that Jesus is working on in me now. And then I think part of it, and this is embarrassing, but there is just the American consumer mentality that is the air we breathe. It's like breathing secondhand smoke. I can't help but imbibe the consumerism of our culture. And in a TED Talk, internet-based podcast world, unless if your local preacher is John Tyson or, a couple of years, not that long ago, Tim Keller, it's pretty hard to not be a little bit bored. And that's just the hard truth. In a pre-recording era, you weren't used to hearing Spurgeon every week. You would just hear your local preacher. And now we're used to Netflix and Hulu and podcasting the best preachers in the world. And that makes it a little harder to sit still for 45 minutes and listen to a good local pastor, but who's not that.
Okay, I've been thinking about that a lot. And I process it, John Mark, through the lens of what I think of as the new scarcity. So you're exactly right. Spurgeon was scarce. I mean, maybe you read his sermons printed up in a newspaper, or you happen to be in a city, he's in the pulpit, you get to hear him once in a lifetime if you're out of town. But information was scarce, which is why 3-point charges, right, which I started at, from the 19th century.
What's
you
that?
do the circuit
What's
on
a
Sunday morning.
What's a 3-point charge?
That's what we call it. United Methodists would know it. Presbyterians would know it. So you can't afford a full pastor as an independent church. So you just go from among 3 churches on a Sunday morning,
right. Yes,
and deliver the message,
like the Methodist kind of,
like the Methodists. Yeah, you do the circuit, right? So it's scarce because where else are you going to hear the word of God proclaimed? 20th century changed that a little bit with television and the whole deal, and Billy Graham and
absolutely
Charles Stanley and you know Joyce Meyer, et cetera. But then 21st century comes along. In the last decade, genie's out of the bottle. Information is everywhere.
That world is gone.
And you know what you said too, because as you were reflecting earlier on the model of church, and you know I led an attractional church for many years, and God really used it, I think, in very, very powerful ways.
Yeah.
But we were able to copy from each other. Rather than here's the 4-fold pattern of worship handed down over the centuries. It's like, oh, I like what these people are doing over here in Portland or New York or Vancouver or wherever you happen to be. You're taking notes. You're like, we can do that faster. We can now start to look like some of the things we've seen. And then the internet just exploded it. But that's also true. Like, I'm not going to be as good as Tim Keller. I'm not going to teach discipleship the way you can teach discipleship and the way you can preach it. So we find ourselves becoming almost imitations of ourselves rather than going deep. So all of that to say, you know, I think the shadow side of that for me is there was some originality, but there was also some copycat, and it leaves you to the point where you're like, is this as good as it gets? You know, to quote that old movie with Jack Nicholson, is this really as good as it gets? Is this all there is? But there are other stages as well.
Yeah.
So what is beyond that? What is beyond it for the church?
Beyond
the first 3 stages, which most of us don't get past.
I mean, in the critical journey, they name the next couple of stages. In their theory, you hit this not a stage, but an experience that, you know, and they label it's not this linear. And they would say over and over again, life is not this linear. And we mature unevenly. We might be ahead in one stage in one aspect of our life and behind in another. But they have this concept they call the wall, which is some kind of an experience. I think of the AA line, the only way out is through. Meaning it's some kind of an experience of pain and suffering that you can't bypass or deny or fake it till you make it. It's something that will permanently stand in your path. It could be a divorce. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be failure, bankruptcy. It could be a terminal disease or a chronic illness, any number of things. But there's no way around it. The only way out is through. And so you can either stop in your spiritual journey or regress in your spiritual journey, which is what a lot of people do. Like the phenomenon of deconstruction, one way to think about that psychologically is people go through the first 3 stages of Christian spiritual development. They hit the wall. They have some kind of experience of pain and suffering. And rather than go through it, they jump ship to another, I'll just use the word religious system. And I mean that in the more Keller sense of like a system of beliefs, ideas, values, practices that give meaning and purpose to life. That could be the 3 most common that I saw in Portland were third wave anti-racism, all things LGBTQ and pride and kind of ally kind of worldview, activist worldview, and then careerism, kind of like work is God. Those are the 3 most common alternative religions that I saw in Portland. So people jump ship and then they go back and they start at phase 1 again. It's awakening, but now it's a different religion. And so it's like they're born again and they're just on a high and they're in this honeymoon phase and I can't believe it. I never saw before and I never realized this and I was blind and I was dumb and I was lost and I've been saved. It's basically a salvation motif. And then they become a life of discipleship. Then they're learning and they're reading and they're taking all of this information in, and then the productive life. Then they're doing things and they're leading things and they're saying things. And it's just inevitable that people will hit the wall again. And then what? So in the critical journeys, the next stage is if you go through the wall, you go into stage 4 that they call the inner journey or the journey inward, which would be basically like the valley, you know what I mean, or the wilderness, this period often marked by a lot of soul searching. In millennial language, you do the work often of therapy around family of origin and your relationship to your parents and your culture and your shadow and your personality and your Enneagram number, all of that stuff. It's good space for that. Then stage 5 is what they call the journey outward. So you go through that. And again, if you continue to mature, and people get stuck at every single one of these phases. There's some people that go into therapy and the deep work, and then 20 years later, they're still
in the deep work,
bemoaning. Still stuck. I'm overwhelmed.
You're 60.
Yeah, and that's important work to do, but you don't want to get stuck there. You need to move through it. Not through it that like we're some problem to solve or some formula that you hack and fix. The human soul is way more complex than that. And I don't mean that in an unkind way at all. Just I think most people would agree there is a season, I see it a lot when people start therapy. It's like it often gets worse before it gets better. And every conversation you have with them is just very negative. And that is actually, I think, a healthy part of almost like getting the impurities out of your system. It's almost like a charcoal cleanse of your body. But you don't want to be there for the rest of your life. You want to move through that to a place of greater acceptance, gratitude, joy, seeing the good and the bad in your experience, in your family, and your parents, and all of that. And so then you go to the journey outward, which is where you kind of begin to reemerge almost into, it looks very similar to stage 3, the productive life. You're out doing things now again. You're leading often. You're serving. You're making a contribution through your church or ministry or work. But so from the outside, it looks very similar to stage 3, but it's very different because your motivational structure is radically different. You don't need what you used to need from success. There's that Rollheiser line, success still feels good in the second half of life, but it has very little to teach us. Meaning, past that stage, we're learning way more from our failure. We learn a lot from our successes early on because they tell us what we should do with our life. Whereas if you have the favor and the grace to be successful at anything at a young age, it's almost like a high five, like you're on the right track from life and God and community, like keep going this direction. So success is very helpful. Not all of us have that gift, but very helpful in the first half. And in the second half, it's great. But
better success than not.
Yes.
But it doesn't own you anymore.
So I have a book coming out.
Feel like
if this book were to sell 1 million copies, that'd be awesome. It is not going to help me be a better husband, wife. It's not going to deal with my anxiety. It's not going to free my heart from it. It might make some of those problems way worse. So, and I already know that I want to write with my life. So it was helpful to have that a little bit early on because it was a sign like, hey, you should write. But now I kind of know that I should write. So now I don't want the book to flop, but it would probably have a better effect on my godliness if this thing were to sell 3 copies, Then I don't, knock on wood. I'm not saying I want that. I'm not asking for that. But so stage 5, you're doing meaningful work, but you are different. Your motivational structure is different. You're more free. You're more detached. You're not like pure love, but you're more motivated by love. And then stage 6 is what they call the life of love. And this is just, most of the people we know in this stage are very old, but I know some people there and they just exude the love of the Trinity. And just the gift is just being in their presence. It's not even if it's a pastoral example, it's not their leadership. Most of them aren't leading actively anymore. It's not necessarily their preaching or teaching or writing, though it might be just dripping with wisdom. It's them. Like I remember visiting Eugene Peterson. I was one of the last pastor groups that got to visit him. And, and he was nearing the end. You could tell he was very elderly at that point. You could tell his body was starting to slowly kind of wind down. But we always said to each other, it's like being in the presence of a saint. And he didn't say anything that we'd not read in his books. So it was not like we were
Wasn't
taking...
Wasn't getting the last unpublished
it's like,
thoughts.
Honestly, every single thing he said we'd read before. And, some of it was kind of boring, but just like being in his presence was just like the peace, the love, the sense of like union with God. You could almost like, it permeated the room. So, that's the final stage. So that's, I think, in their theory, again, this is all theory. This is not capital T truth. But in their theory, those are kind of the next stages that come. And I think that as a general rule, the first 3 stages are more linear, and the last 3 stages are not linear at all. So if you were to draw it out, it wouldn't be a straight line, but it'd be more of just a slow kind of windy line through those first 3 stages. And then, by stages 4 and 5, it would just be a bird's nest, you know what I mean? Of just forward, backward. We often feel like we're regressing, not progressing. We're breaking down, not breaking through, and we're in the wilderness, not in the promised land. And those often are the seasons in the second half of life where we grow the most. And often we don't even realize it because we're so aware that we're not in control of our formation. And those first stages, I feel like our spiritual formation, our discipleship, we feel a little bit more in control of them. And in the second stages, we becomes much clearer to us that we are absolutely not in control of our formation. And God's grace is targeting us at the areas that we are most desperately in need of it, and often in the areas that we don't even want it. We're like, don't touch that in me, God. Leave it alone.
Don't make this book a flop.
Or it's too painful. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that would be good for me to be free of the need for a successful book, but the pain would be too deep. I'm okay, thank you. And thankfully, at this point, hopefully our heart has been given over deeply enough to Jesus that he's able to come in and do things not against our will, because I don't think that's how God works, but he's able to tap into our deeper will of surrender.
Did you have a wall, like a definitive wall that kind of moved you from those first 3 stages going, there's got to be something more?
Oh yeah, I've had multiple.
Okay.
How much time do you have?
Yeah, we have all day.
I mean, I've had multiple. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about one? I mean, for me, it was burnout. And I'm not saying it hasn't been since then. That was 18 years ago, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
But like that is a clear before and after moment in my life. And so much as you were going through the different stages, so much of that resonated with me because I did the deconstruction. I remember when my counselor said to me, whatever that was, stage 4, I guess, or 5. And I remember the moment I was in his office, in his house, in his basement, and he said to me, right now you're in the pit of deconstruction. We're going to do some reconstruction, but some people never see that. They get stuck here and you won't. And I'm like, that's terrifying because I was in a horrible place. And, we do see the light of day. And you're right, like success. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not ambitious. I'm not saying my motives are pure because they're not. I wrestle with them every day. But like, it's different. Success just doesn't feel, it doesn't have its talons in me like it used to. And I think on some days, it still does. And there's something I probably need to apologize for later today that I said to somebody. It's like, all right, here we are again, old Carey.
Yep.
Get up there and do that. But what would a wall have been for you?
Yeah, I mean, the same one of burnout, which for me was tied, and it's interesting, you're never the same after. Like, I still don't have the energy that I had back. I've never recaptured it. And and that one for me, which was a number of years ago now, was tied to my failure maybe failure is too strong of a word. I don't think so. But as a megachurch pastor, because the short version of that story was, we were this kind of multi-site megachurch that I resigned from, not out of any scandal or anything, but I was 30 years old and we had, I think, 93 people on staff, and I just was probably 2 decades away from being mature enough to handle that, and probably about 3 personalities away from being ever good at that. And so that was a real wall in my ecclesiology, my view of church, and my kind of dream for my life. Another one was just my marriage, and my wife was chronically ill for 15 years. And some of them very severe. And that was one of those, like, there's no way around it. We've seen every doctor, we spent thousands and thousands of dollars, we've been prayed for so many times, and it was just really bad. And I was never going to have anything even close to approximating the marriage that I thought I was saying yes to on my wedding day. And there's a long story there. She's since been miraculously healed 2 years ago, very unexpectedly, but after a long time of, 15 years, not a short period of time.
Because I know you've told a little bit of that story before, and John Thompson, mutual friend, right, was involved in that. He's got a book called Deliverance,
it's great,
which is about that. But how did you come to terms with that? Because I think there's a lot of people, whether it's a marriage that isn't working out the way you hoped, or that is still limping, or a church that you had great hope for, and you're not called away, but your ministry is just stuck. Like, What went on inside you to help you through those days where you didn't know what was going to get better?
Well, I think it's a good question because it's a question of when, not if. Like life will serve you up the wall. So it may be your marriage, it may be your ministry, it may be something entirely different. It may be your children, it may be your family, it may be anything, the sector of the economy that you work in that goes away. But it's only a question of time. And so I think whatever the example is, marriage or ministry or whatever, I think it's a really good question to ask. I wish I had some like alliterating 3 bullet points, but prayer, and it's the simple. It's funny how like, I'm always resistant when people are like, life is simple, like following Jesus is simple. I'm like, life is anything but simple. Life is like extraordinarily complex. Why I hate ideology on both the left and the right. It's why I often can't stand a lot of Christian preaching. It's not honest about how difficult and complex life is. It's why I love literature, because it is honest about how difficult and complex life is. And it's why I wish preaching was a little bit more like literature, because the Bible is literature. It's not commercial. The Bible does not read like a Marvel movie. It reads, like, I remember reading James Bell's Plot and Structure, where he's a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he had these two, kind of a commercial plot line versus a literary plot line, and he kind of graphs them out, and this is what a commercial plot line looks like, and every action movie you've ever seen, it's, kind of looks like a stock market, like it's rising action up and to the right, and then kind of knockout ending and whatever, and then they show the literary plot line, and it's this just kind of very ambiguous, up and down and depressive, and at the end it's either a hopeful ending or an ambiguous ending. And I just remember thinking, oh, that made so much sense of the Bible for me. First time I ever read Steinbeck's East of Eden, I feel like I understood how to read the Old Testament for the first time. And I realized the Bible is normally preached like a commercial plot line, but it's a literary plot line.
That's where my mind went. It's like we're doing commercial plot line sermons every Sunday.
And rising tide, action, knockout ending, boom, let's go. And there's a place for that. Like who doesn't want to go see a good action movie once or twice a year? But life, very few people feel like Thor when they're like going through, maybe Thor's bad phase when he was like overweight, and, beer belly Thor. We can relate to that Thor, but most of us don't feel that way. And so many of the stories in scriptures, like all the Old Testament stories about how most of the kings end badly. And then it's like, and Asa was diseased in his feet and then he died.
I know.
And you're like, wait.
And you read it twice in Kings and Chronicles.
You're
it's
like waiting,
and again.
Where's the ending? Like, what's the point? What's the moral of this story? But yet, how many people have these incredible ministries, are used so powerfully of God, and then something goes a little wonky in their heart? Not a lot wonky, just a little wonky, and they end kind of a little like weird and off in their heart, and some broken things about their life, and they die. Like, that's real life. So I think we're strayed pretty far from your question at this point.
That's all right.
But I think part of the way forward is a greater honesty with hopefulness. And the key is, I call it spiritual realism. How do you honestly name the reality of the spiritual journey with hope and not with cynicism? Because there's a lot of utopian idealism, or like over-realized eschatology, or John Woolman calls it spiritual bypassing, which is a lot of evangelical preaching. And then there's a ton of cynicism, deconstructionism, everybody's horrible.
He told you it wasn't going to work.
Let's see the worst side of everything. And neither of those are reality. Life is much better and much more not as rosy. It's both. And life is deeply broken and deeply beautiful at the same time. And maturity is being able to, even psychological maturity is being able to hold those together. And that's very hard. Most people pick a side. So back to what's the solution? I don't know what the solution is. I know things that I found incredibly helpful. Deep relationships. I'm talking about the 1 to 5 here. And just bearing my soul, to people that deeply loved me and I can trust. Therapy was extraordinarily helpful, which is kind of in that same category. But, I have the gift of just a extraordinary therapist, been with for 13 years now or so. And this is me in 13 years of therapy. Can you believe that, Carey? This is
amazing.
The 13-year of therapy me. Can you imagine me without it? Oh my gosh.
Going on year 20.
I'm such a mess with it. And prayer, and by prayer I mean more contemplative ways of being with God in prayer and in Scripture. Not that I don't think we ever mature beyond intercession. Certainly not if we read the teachings of Jesus, who said a lot about asking. But I think there's a type of prayer that is less wordy, that is much quieter, that feels more like resting than working. It is deeply transformative. I think one of the most important books I've read in a long time is the new work by Dr. Todd Hall out of Rosemead School of Psychology. It's called Relational Spirituality. It's an academic work. He has a popular one out yet. I just ordered it today. I haven't read it, called The Connected Life. I have no opinion on it because I haven't read it yet, but his academic work, I think, is the most important book written since Willard and Foster, 40 plus years ago. I think it's a very important contribution to the spiritual formation conversation. And at the end, he has all this, he's actually found and done studies on what spiritual practices, what forms of Christian spirituality produce deep change in people. He's found the people trying to empirically verify through peer-reviewed studies what has the effect. And you'd have to have him on to get the nuanced, good version of it. But at the end, he basically says, there are 3 things that we can point to and we say, we know this produces transformation in people. One is forms of contemplative prayer. And I don't think he necessarily means like the Jesus prayer or centering prayer, but just quieter forms of prayer where your mind is deeply contemplating through your imagination and your spirit who God is, the nature and the person of God. Second is deep, long-term friendships, relationships, the 1 to 5. And third is suffering.
Okay.
So that's
the one you don't want to sign up for,
That's
right?
the path.
Yeah.
Contemplative prayer, deep relationships, and suffering. Which I think if you think about a Sunday service can help those things. They really can. It can give framework for that. It can give encouragement for that.
If you're willing to do lament from time to time.
Yeah. But really that's the path.
Wow.
And so I think that's the stuff. You don't have to give up Sunday services to have deep relationships, pray contemplatively every day, and suffer with Jesus. But I think those 3, that's the path you walk. So I don't know, it's probably pretty simple, but I think some of those aspects for me, really it's, the whole Rolheiser, and have you read Sacred Fire?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so it's probably in my top 3, for sure top 10. I read it every summer. Ron Rolheiser, Catholic, he's actually an academic, but spiritual writer. He's writing a trilogy. The 3rd one's not out yet. This is the 2nd book, but you can just read this. Basically, every person over the age of 30 who is following Jesus should read this book.
Okay.
And it's about kind of discipleship.
I think you quote him a lot, right?
I quote him constantly.
Yeah.
And it's about discipleship in what he would call the long middle years of life. So you're no longer in those early kind of 20-something stages of trying to make a life and a career and get married and have kids and, do your thing. And you're not elderly and, winding down. You're in those long years. And he tells this beautiful story from, I think it's a Greek novelist. I think you pronounce his name Kazantzakis. I could be wrong on that. Who writes about, in his memoir, he's Greek, writes about going to see an elderly Orthodox monk as a young man and saying, Father Macarius, do you wrestle with God? Do you still wrestle with God? I'm sorry, do you still wrestle, the question is, Father Macarius, do you still wrestle with the devil? And Father Macarius says, no, I have grown too old and he has grown old with me. Then he says, I wrestle with God. And the young man says, you wrestle with God and you hope to win. And he says, no, I hope to lose. And Rolheiser just kind of takes that as a picture. In our youth, we're wrestling with the devil, you know what I mean? In the sense where, and I think in a symbolic way too, we're wrestling with these fiery energies of sexuality, ambition, ego, fear, and we're trying to conquer them. We're trying to overcome them. It's like the Revelation idea, the 1 John idea, to those who overcome. But in the second half of life, really we're more wrestling with God, with his appointment over our life, with how our life is gone, with forgiveness, sadness, disappointment. And we're not trying to win. We're no longer trying to
I'm hoping I lose.
God to bend our life into the shape we want. We're trying to learn how to live with genuine joy inside the contours of the life we actually have. Not the life we thought we'd have, or we wanted to have, or we wish we had, but we actually had. How do we, remember Todd Hunter saying to me once, you must find the goodness of God in your actual life. So I think that's the journey of the second half. It's less about conquering the mountain and more about accepting. What was the Merton line? I have mixed feelings on Thomas Merton, but like he said, we spend the first half of our life climbing the ladder of success only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall.
Yeah. Truth. So I'm curious, one of the themes so far in this conversation that keeps coming up is motivations. And it's something that I wrestle with clearly in the second half of life, still on a daily basis.
Not me. I'm just pure altruism. I have transcended the ego.
I'm taking notes. No, but like it's different, but it doesn't really go away. And so talking about a book launch, talking about if you were still pastoring, right? This next series, going to be the best series, this Practicing the Way. It's going to be amazing. How do you know you're on the journey with your motivations and not just continually deceiving yourself?
I think it's important to name without shame or denial the fact that our motivations are generally mixed. And I remember our mutual friend Ortberg saying to me, I'm not really sure at what point in my heart I am no longer serving the church, but the church is serving me. And I'm not sure I want to know.
No.
I just know that when I get up to preach a sermon, or when I release a book, or that both of those motivational structures are in my heart. There is a part of me that genuinely wants to participate in the outflow of love from the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit toward these people. I want to be caught up in it. I want to be used. Christians are the only people that ever say, I feel used, and it's a good thing because we can feel used by God and feel it's an honor. And there's a part of me that wants to sell a bunch of books or want people to like me or think I'm smart or think I'm godlier than I am or all sorts of things. And I don't know what that breakdown is. I don't think I want to know, what is it 50-50? Is it 80-20? Which way? I just know they're both there. And to ignore, who did I read recently who said, Freud was wrong about pretty much everything, but he was right in that whatever we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves grows in power. So it's the aspects of our shadow that we refuse to look at. We refuse to admit, we refuse to name, we refuse to repent of, or we refuse just to admit to God or to ourselves that actually are the cause of so much of our self-defeating behavior, so much of our unloving behavior. And because we give it power. When we don't name something, you give it power. And when you name something, it doesn't fix it. Like to say, this is a broken pattern that I have toward my wife or my children, and it's rooted in this experience in my life or childhood. That doesn't fix it, but it sure takes its power dramatically down. Self-awareness is not the whole journey, but it is a huge beginning step. So I think naming that aspect of ourself is really key, just honestly. And then so really the question I think you're asking is what a Christian psychologist would say is the question of attachments, or in Calvinist or Reform language, the question of idols. idols of the heart. Thomas Keating called them our emotional programs for happiness. There's also, you can talk about it spiritually through the idol metaphor of Keller. You can talk about it psychologically through personality development. And there's a whole theory of psychology that basically says our personalities are developed as coping mechanisms for pain. And we all choose these different coping mechanisms that are all an attempt to basically run away from pain. And those, we develop a strategy. Like, so for me as a, perfectionist, somehow in my pre-conscious, prefrontal cortex brain, my body, my personhood developed this strategy of I will make the world around. I mean, you're in my living room and it's dirty. This is actually the end of the week. It's really dirty, but you don't see anything out of place other than these cameras. And yeah, but this beauty is actually my psychosis. This is actually my brokenness.
Yeah, it's like my lawn lines. I'm insane.
Yes, there you go. So somehow I developed the strategy. I will make my environment perfect, and that's how I will feel safe and okay. And that's actually a really defeating coping strategy for life, because life is not perfect. And then when you have 3 teenagers, they're certainly not perfect. And a relaxed, happy, actually much more psychologically adjusted wife, she is not perfect either. And they leave stuff around, and then I behave toward them in ways that are incredibly unloving. And I would be a much better dad if I was messy. And, tidiness is not a virtue really, So all that to say, we develop these coping strategies, and I think naming them, seeing them is a huge step forward. But whatever these attachments are, where we develop these emotional attachments to our coping strategy of choice, which is just a way of saying we need this thing emotionally. It's an emotional reality. We need this marriage, success, book to sell so many copies, podcast to be what rated as whatever number. We need this in order to be happy and at peace. And most of the things that we need as we, get farther down the spiritual journey are all good things. They're not bad things. They're good things. Very rare for them to be, as you mature, bad things. But our need for them causes us to behave. First off, it causes us to be miserable. And it makes us just very unhealthy and unhappy. And more importantly, it makes us behave in ways that are unloving. So, Carey, I wish I could preach a sermon on 3 ways to be free of your attachment. I know that we go to prayer and we hold our attachments before Jesus and we say, not my will, but your will be done. But in my experience, really the most powerful way to set the heart free from attachment is when our fears come true and we lose the very thing that we thought we needed. And then we realize we're still okay. So most of the attachments that I've been freed of have not been through my godliness or my spiritual discipline regimen or some book I read. They've been through life or God or Satan or whatever, stripping away from me the very thing that I clung to, and me realizing on the other side, oh, I'm okay. It's part of me stepping down from the pastorate. There is a painful stripping away of what I now realize was an attachment to I am a pastor of this kind of a church in this kind of a city in this kind of a role. And then once that's stripped away, who are you? And it is painful. It is excruciating. It is nerve-wracking. You're pulsing with anxiety. And I'm not through it yet, but I can tell you now, I feel more free than I have ever felt in my life. And that does not mean I start preaching again this Sunday. That doesn't mean that the next 4 weeks as I preach, that I'm going to just be pure love, just pure altruism. I'm only here
Sunday
for
too.
But it does mean that I think I'm more free than I've ever been. And I can still hopefully serve and do what I feel God made me to do. But the thought of never doing ministry again and just, remodeling houses or something on the side and just reading books and loving Jesus for the rest of my life, I don't know how I would respond to that, but I can tell you that thought holds no fear for me. And I could not have said that to you a couple of years ago. And that's not because I'm a good person. It's because what I feared came to pass at some level and was stripped away. And it turns out that it was liberation.
So, it's interesting too, because you and I have joked about how we're both neat freaks. And, you talked about you're going to redo the whole house and everything like that. I get that. I do that in my yard. My wife has great taste as well. And
I've seen pictures of your yard. You're a clean garage person.
Clean garage.
My dad literally said, people that have clean garages and no dogs are evil people.
Thank you.
And then that's
Satan. No, I'll tell you, it's crazy. Like my family paid a price for that.
Yeah.
When the kids were younger, because I wasn't nice if stuff wasn't done. So right now it's fall at home. We're recording this months in advance. There are leaves all over the place. 10 years ago, that would have driven me crazy. Who can get to my house today? No, I want it all clean. You know what? It's probably going to be chaos when I get home. I'm still going to make it neat. It'll stay neat I'm going to spend 3 hours on it. It'll be neat for 2 minutes for a quick picture. Then it's all going to fall down again. And God's like, you lose, you lose, you lose, you lose. And I'm increasingly okay with it. But this is where I'm going with the question. I was looking at Practicing the Way. I was on your website. I was looking at your talks. I was reading your book. Beautiful. Like your writing is so clear, so pure, so beautiful. I kept as I was reading through the book, the manuscript, I'm like, how do you go this deep and this comprehensible? Because I got to read an early copy. People are like, what was it like? What was it like? I'm like, you know what? You could hand this to someone in 6th grade. They'd be able to understand. I don't know that they'd understand all the concepts, but like, you're not that super dense. Like it's so clean. It's beautifully designed. Your videos are that way. So it's one of those things that your obsession also gets leveraged as a gift.
Yes.
In places.
Yes.
I think that's true for a lot of us, right? Mm-hmm. How do you wrestle with that tension? Because if you just let it go and sloppy John Mark shows up, and suddenly your videos are not nice quality and your writing is unedited and incomprehensible, that's not good either. So there's this tension, like part of that obsession on my part for cleanliness and everything. When it's sanctified, I don't know whether it gets sanctified. That might be a bold claim, but there are parts of that has made me who I am and that God has used. And then there are parts of it where Satan's like, field day, let's go to town.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Because it's a bit of a mixed bag, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, and I think there's a generic answer and a specific answer because that's a specific example of perfectionism.
Well, we both. I mean, your videos are much nicer than mine, but and your writing is just like as a writer, I'm like, ooh, so good.
Oh,
but I think some of that is that obsessive tendency that you have.
Yeah, it would be clinically diagnosable OCPD. So
what's the P?
So there's a difference between OCD and OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Okay.
The way that was I have the latter. These are human constructs that it's not like you can test your blood and you have OCPD.
There it is. Yeah.
I display behavioral characteristics regularly that align with a category in the DSM called OCPD. The way my therapist explained it, he said, a person with genuine OCD, they're in college, they rewrite a paper 9 times, they're up through the night, and they don't turn it in on time because they were so obsessive they couldn't get it right, and so they fail the class, or they fail, or they get a bad grade. A person with OCPD rewrites it 3, 4, 5 times till 2 a.m, falls asleep exhausted, gets an A+, and then is just cranky and grouchy the rest of the day. And he told me, you've basically never met a surgeon, an airline pilot, or a highly skilled professional at a craft who doesn't have OCPD.
Okay.
And there's something about that drivenness. So the specific example, that's a specific example, and I think I'm still trying to figure out the answer to that, but I think it's learning to value goodness, not perfection, that there is such a thing as good enough, One of the things I've long hated about preaching is it's a perfectionist nightmare because you just don't have the time to craft, if you're preaching, for me, it was 32 Sundays a year, you do not have the time that you have with a book or a magnum opus to put, like you have 2 mornings a week maybe or something, 2 days a week in my case. But I've actually now come to love it because there's a clear sense. It's in a way easier than a book because it's like, hey, this week, I'm preaching Sunday. I have Wednesday and Thursday till noon, both days, and I've done some pre-work to write up this thing. And that's all I have. And if I get in a fight with my wife or one of my kids, interrupts that time, or I get sick, or, something goes wrong, then I just throw myself on the grace of God as always, and I'll get up Sunday and I'll preach. Like you did the best with what you can. There's that saying in writing, I'm sure you're familiar with this. You're never done writing, you're just out of time.
Yes.
And that is such a true statement, especially if you're a perfectionist. I never feel, people are like, do you feel like the book's ready? I'm like, no, never. I want to rewrite the whole thing right now. So that's a perfectionist example, learning to just value goodness and excellence, and learning to do goodness out of love, not out of some anxiety coping mechanism.
Obsession that if this is perfect, I will be completed.
Yes. For me, perfectionism is an anxiety coping mechanism, which goes back to deep, deep stuff in me. And so I think if I can get it perfect, then I will be safe and good and all that. But I think at a larger, more generic, that's such a good question, because I think there's this pattern that often the very things that make us successful at work make us failures in what matters most.
Right.
So the things that can make us just highly, accomplished or driven or whatever, often the things that make us successful at leadership that are often, the world will, the market economy, and this is not some political statement, will often reward bad behavior.
Yes.
It will reward you killing
Look at how
your
it
soul.
boosted these results. Best quarter ever.
Exactly. Or, prioritizing your work over your marriage and your children. I mean, there's this conspiracy that a lot of us face when we hit middle age, where our careers, whatever you do for a living, whatever your gender is, our careers are their most lucrative, most impactful at the very time where our children, in particular if you're a father, and it's like just developmental psychology with kids take more from a father as they get a little bit older. And that's not, I don't mean that's some patriarchal, that's just like the secular literature would say, younger kids primarily gravitate toward mom, and then as they get older, there's an emotional shift toward dad. And so in the same way that for many women, there's this huge drain on their career life when their kids are little, fathers often face that when their kids get a little bit older. So there is not a day that goes by where I do not have to fight a civil war in my heart. Will I prioritize my job or my children? And when I prioritize my job, I can make more money, I can get more accolades, I can do something and feel like it went well. I almost never feel that way as a dad. I feel like I worked so hard, and at the end of the day, I just did these 9 things wrong and lost my temper, and I'm gonna have to apologize for this, and I'm praying for my kid here. And so I think the general principle is often the things that make us successful at our work can, if we are left unchecked, be the very undoing of, it's David Brooks' whole idea of resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And the things that people will talk about at my funeral, whether it's tomorrow or in 50 years, and the things that I want people to talk about at my funeral have almost nothing to do with the work meetings that I'm going into right after this, and the email and how this book does. Nobody's going to talk about that.
Nope.
Nobody's going to care.
No one's going to bring up number of downloads on the podcast.
I had the chance to go. We were family friends with the evangelist Luis Palau for pretty much my whole life. My dad was his worship leader. And, especially in the Spanish-speaking world, I mean, he is easily on par with Billy Graham. And he has preached the gospel to, I don't even know the number, millions upon millions.
What a beautiful
upon millions.
soul. I spent some time with him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I had the chance, because we're family friends, to go to a small kind of family and friends funeral for him, not the big public memorial. And I was so struck. Here's this 2-hour thing. My dad led worship for it, and we were there, the Plows and their lovely family. Not a word was said about his ministry. Not a word about how many people he preached to, how many books he sold, how many people are in the kingdom of God. It was just all grandkids getting up, saying we went on vacation together as a family every year, and every morning of vacation at 6 a.m., you take a different grandkid out, including the ones that aren't Christians, and love on them and not judge them. And it was just all that stuff. It was all funny stories about him working out in the morning. It was mostly about him being a dad and a grandfather. And he wasn't perfect, but he ended well. And I think that deeply imprinted on me. Like, when my moment comes, nobody is going to care about the things that keep me up at night right now. And the things that matter most, I don't get paid for.
Wow.
You
Yeah,
know?
that is so true. So, you mentioned a few people, and I can't believe we haven't gotten to the book. So we're going to have to.
No, we don't need to get to the book at all.
People should read it. People
Hey,
should
this
read
is
it.
Your podcast, and I'm just talking way too much.
It's so good. So good. So, you mentioned Eugene Peterson, who I had the privilege of interviewing. You mentioned Richard Foster, who also came on the podcast.
Wow.
The thing that surprised me about Eugene Peterson and Richard Foster is they were both recovering driven people.
Yes.
But so are you.
Yeah.
Right? That was Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Lots of people, maybe millions of people have read it. But like, you're kind of like, hey, this is for me. Like, I'm very, very driven. To what extent is practicing the way, self-diagnosis, self-healing, I need to do some work in this area?
You mean the book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the philosophy.
I think suffering, one of the most meaningful redemptions of suffering is when your pain, in particular some of the unnecessary pain often brought about by our own bad decision-making, can be used to spare other people of their pain or help them in their pain. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the, stages of grief, I don't know if I could do it from memory. Help me out here. It's denial, anger, bargaining.
Where does
the fourth
acceptance
one? And acceptance
come?
is
And then
the fifth
acceptance
one.
is number 5.
But, her team came back a number of years later, and nobody quotes this because it didn't make it into the initial bestseller, and basically said, we're missing a stage. There's a 6th stage, and it's meaning. So acceptance is actually not the end. It's not just I've accepted that my wife is chronically ill, or that I was a failure here, or that my children, or whatever. That's not actually the end. The full, complete healing and development of that process is meaning. When your suffering has meaning. And one of the, I think, best ways that happens, that often we can't control, but we can certainly participate in, is when we partner with God to see our pain, our suffering, our failure, our lessons learned in hard knocks of life, used to help other people. And so I think a lot of what Practicing the Way is doing, I would not view this book as my, self-therapeutic outlet. It's not, maybe it is. I've not thought about it that way. I think I would need to go reflect on that and pray about that. I'm sure there's always an aspect of that in anything you write or preach or teach. But I think I want to give people the paradigm and the frameworks that I wish I had when I was coming up, so driven and inside, I don't even know what the word evangelical means anymore, but inside a kind of traditional evangelical. Ruth Barton has a line in one of her books where she writes, I had come to the end of what the traditional evangelical discipleship model had to offer me. And I think that's her way of saying I got through stage 3. And then I was like, okay, so what now? And I think I would love this book's written for all ages, but I would be beautiful if a 25-year-old could read this book and could get to where I've got to just in, realizing Jesus' invitation, 10 or 15 years ahead of me, and could maybe set some different metrics for success and could build a life architecture that is actually organized around formation, not around accomplishment. Not that accomplishment is bad. I think we're made to do good works and meaningful work. I still work really hard. But I would like to think that my organizing center is very different now.
I love the framework. Can you walk us through just the 30,000-foot view of sort of the Practicing the Way framework?
Yeah, honestly, this book is just me. I'm a popularizer, and I would say that without shame. I feel like that's part of my role. Is I want to summarize and synthesize all that's out there. So there's this incredible body of learning in the, broadly speaking, the spiritual formation world, which includes and touches on therapy, social sciences, neuroscience, body-based stuff, ancient Christian spirituality. And so I'm just trying to kind of summarize it and synthesize it. I cannot even get readers to read Willard, who's very much my intellectual father. And if I was a Catholic, he would be my patron saint. And I think he would be a saint if he was Catholic. And so I'm just wanting to write up that schema. And it comes through my own personality. It's a movie called Vengeance. Did you see that about the podcaster?
I did. Is that BJ Novak?
Yes.
Yes,
did you see it?
That's a brilliant movie.
Okay, brilliant.
That's a brilliant movie.
Podcaster that you are. Great movie. It's kind of an odd, I'm not endorsing the movie.
It's really funny.
So odd ending. Very funny. But okay, so best character in that movie was Ashton Kutcher's character. I forget his name.
Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away. He plays this like Texas movie producer that you kind of hate. But then he has a couple moments where he just gives like a little, not speech, but like monologue that is so profound. I mean, so profound. And you're kind of expect him to be dumb or whatever, but he's so profound. And he has this one moment, I could not quote it verbatim, but when I have doing a teaching on homiletics in a couple of weeks, and I will quote this verbatim. He basically says, he has this whole piece on creativity as listening and how your voice, what people call finding your voice, is when you listen deeply. And as you translate what you hear, that's your voice. So I think I'm trying to listen deeply to some of these luminaries, ancient and modern, in particular to Willard, and translate it for millennials and Gen Z and people today, and hope that it's not plagiarism, that it's my voice,
There's a lot of footnotes.
There's a lot. This is the first book I've ever been terrified of plagiarism for, not because I secretly copy pasted anything, but because I at some of these books and some of these ideas are so deep in me, I'm not totally sure like where a phrase came from or idea came from, or, it's deep, 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 deep in me. So I'm trying to translate all of that and hoping that, man, if people could get some of this paradigm in them before I did, that would be awesome. So I'm basically just trying to channel some of the paradigm of discipleship to Jesus, and I'm intentionally not using the word disciple. I'm, opting for the word apprenticeship, partially because I think it's a better English translation of mathetes, the Greek word, and partially because I think, and I say this, whenever you say with humility, that probably means you don't actually have humility.
In my humble opinion.
Means in my arrogant, dogmatic view. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around the word discipleship.
Yeah.
Even the way that it's used as a verb by modern evangelicals. Who are you discipling?
Yeah, you make the argument you can't disciple somebody.
Yeah, it's not a verb. Yes, I argue in a book on discipleship that you can't disciple somebody. And I think I argue well for that. I don't know. Let readers be the judge. But just kind of this framework of an apprentice of Jesus, which I define as a life organized around 3 driving goals: to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do as he did. And that's the kind of basic schema for the book.
Yeah, and it's so simple, and yet it's so beautiful. One of the arguments you make is that everyone is being spiritually formed.
Yes.
And I found that
core
very,
idea.
very
Yes.
compelling.
Spiritual formation is not a Christian thing.
So let's talk about that. What do you mean that everybody, like atheists are being spiritually formed, deconstructionists are being spiritually formed,
Yes.
New converts are being spiritually formed? It's not like, oh, I'm going to begin spiritual formation now, and today I start being formed. Take that thought down the road.
Well, I think spiritual formation is just a quasi-biblical phrase for what happens to everybody. It's the process. I'm not talking about spiritual formation in the way of Jesus. That's a different definition. Just spiritual formation. It's the process by which our spirit, meaning our inner person, our inner woman or man, is formed into a particular shape, or what we would call a character or a personality. That's a whole Keller interesting aside, the shift from a character-based culture to a personality culture, from an obsession with virtue to an obsession with personality theories. Very interesting. That's a rabbit hole. And so yes, I think it was James K. Smith that first introduced me to this idea that spiritual formation is not optional. It happens to all people. You have been formed since before you came out of your mother's womb. You were being spiritually formed when you were still in your mother's womb.
How?
You are being formed. You will be formed, because complex factors within and without us, from our habits to what we watch on TV, to our family of origin, to what's happening in our mother's body when she was pregnant. All of these things form us. They have an effect on the development of our person, of our character, of our personality, of who we are or who we are not. So I occasionally hear people say, like, I'm really getting into spiritual formation. And I never judge them for that. But what they mean is like, I'm starting to read Willard or Foster, or I'm practicing silence or Sabbath, or I'm doing contemplative prayer, or I'm in therapy. Great things. But I just want to say, like, listen, you've been into spiritual formation since before you were conscious, And I think I write in the book that Mother Teresa was the product of spiritual formation. Gandhi was the product of spiritual formation. Hitler was the product of spiritual formation. All of these people have been spiritually formed into a particular kind of person. And Christian spiritual formation, or spiritual formation in the way of Jesus, or what I would just call apprenticeship to Jesus, is an intentional effort to partner with Jesus by adopting his lifestyle, not just his belief system, but his way of life and his truth of life, in order to let him form us into a particular shape, into people of Christ-like love.
And one of the things you point out is we're not particularly known for our lovingness as Christians in this culture. That's a big critique of discipleship in the church, right? When you look at it, it's by your fruit you will know them. And it's like, I don't know whether I like this fruit. So in what ways, one of the distinctions you made, which Craig Rochelle's also made in his last book, but training versus trying.
Yeah,
found that very, very helpful.
That's a Richard Foster thing. Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about that.
If that didn't come through, then maybe that was plagiarism. I don't know.
No. I just thought that was really helpful. I mean,
yes.
There's nothing new under the sun. What else? But training versus trying, because I think about that. I've been working out not seriously, but 4 times a week for a year and a half. And I'm like, when I get discouraged, I think, okay, I'm training, I'm not trying.
Yes.
I'm training, I'll get 100 push-ups today, I'll get 90 or whatever, but I'm not trying. That's very, because, I can get discouraged in my devotion. Sometimes it feels really quiet when I'm reading scripture. Sometimes when I'm praying, I'm distracted. What was that quote about your mind is not a barrel of monkeys, but it's similar to that?
Yes, the noun quote is monkeys in a banana tree.
Yeah, monkeys in a banana tree.
Yes.
That describes my prayer brain. Mm-hmm. So talk about the power of training.
Not trying. Okay, so that's a Richard Foster line. In 1978, he writes Celebration of Discipline, just about 45 minutes from where I've spent the last 20 years of ministry in Newburgh, Oregon at George Fox University. And then he travels all over the country and the world for a couple of years. And he basically goes from just nobody's ever heard of him to widely known in the kind of, 1980s evangelicalism. And he was deeply disheartened at the end of that. This is my summary of things I've heard him say. By just the state of discipleship, the low kind of standard of spiritual maturity and transformation.
And this is 40 years ago.
That's normative. Yeah, absolutely. So we want to say a lot of things as the result of political polarization or the internet, but Robert Lovelace is writing about what he calls the sanctification gap in evangelicalism in 1978. Way before post-Christianity, deconstructionism, digital stuff, scandals, way before it, he's saying there's a major problem with evangelicalism with discipleship. And so same time, 1978, that's when he releases Celebration of Discipline. So his conclusion after traveling all over is that most Christians think they change by trying, not by training. Now that will sound counterintuitive because it doesn't match the theological platitudes that we mouth a lot. So most evangelical Christians would have all sorts of Christianese, and that's too cynical, would have all sorts of theological statements and beliefs about how salvation is God's work and it's God who does it. And they'd have cliches like let go and let God and all of that. But if you were to actually follow people, if this is possible, it's impossible, thank God. If you could actually follow people's inner spirit around with a camera 24 hours a day, you would find that no matter how hardcore Reformed Calvinistic sovereignty of God, it's all about God and his glory and it's not you at all. No matter how far down that path they are, most people, if they're trying to overcome a sin or a bad self-destructive behavior, an unloving behavior, just grit their teeth and keep trying harder to stop. and rather than training. So a key turning point for me was, I'm pretty Anabaptist in my kind of theological view of things. And so Sermon on the Mount for me is like plays a disproportionate role in as center kind of gravity. Really love the Sermon on the Mount. And, I'm really saddened by how many attempts there have been down through church history and in the world today to explain the Sermon on the Mount away. And there's multiple. There's at least a half a dozen different ways, from Luther to all sorts of different people, dispensationalists, who've tried to read it in such a way that, well, that's not really for, like, Jesus is not expecting
this
you
is
to
utopian.
live this way.
You're not going to actually live that
or it's
way.
to show you that you can never measure up to the law. There's different readings. I don't think so at all. I think that's a gross misunderstanding of the Sermon on the Mount. I think it ignores the Beatitudes, which are all the gospel. I think the Sermon on the Mount is the vision of discipleship. And it assumes mess. Jesus assumes that you will want to divorce your wife and lust and objectify women in particular and members of the opposite sex, and that you'll be anxious, and that you'll worship money, not God, and that you'll have judgment and contempt for other people, and that you'll say mean things to people. He assumes all of this for disciples of Jesus. And at the same time, he calls us to this radically high bar. But what's often missed in the Sermon on the Mount is it begins and he ends with two statements about practice. That's where our language of practicing the way comes from. So in chapter 5, at the beginning, right before his first of the 14 teachings that make up the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, but I say to you, the first one's on anger and murder. He has this beautiful line, whoever practices and teaches these things will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then the ending of the Sermon on the Mount is something that no modern preacher would ever dare allow preached in his church, because it does not end how a sermon is supposed to end. It ends the story that I grew up in Sunday school with, of the two houses, the house built on sand, the house built on the rock. And it's, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice will be called great, but whoever hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice will be like the foolish person who built their house in the sand. Rains came, floods came, crashed, and it fell with a great crash. And that's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I would have been rebuked for ending sermons with that way, because it doesn't end with the assurance of but
it's all going to be okay.
It's all, Jesus done it all for you.
But what are we seeing?
It's a literary end. It's a haunting warning. But I was so struck. He begins and he ends. He bookends the Sermon on the Mount with this idea of practice. And I interpret that to mean this beautiful vision of life that is not utopian. It is completely grounded in the brokenness of the human condition. He assumes it will take practice, a lifetime of practice in community. The Sermon on the Mount is written to a community of people. It's written to disciples, plural, not singular. He assumes it will take a life of practice in community. So I think, and this analogy breaks down really fast, but I used to run, my knees I'm having issues with. I used to do triathlon every summer, and I do long form racing. So I just imagine, if you're, let's say, hypothetical scenario, you are wildly out of shape. You're overweight, or you never go beyond your computer and your Red Bull, and you're asthmatic, and you just decide one day, I want to run a marathon. How do you run a marathon? Do you walk outside, buy some running shoes off the internet, put them on, walk outside, and just try really hard to run 26.2 miles?
Good luck.
No. I don't care how hard you try or how good your genetics are. You cannot go out and run 26.2 miles. You will die. You will collapse on the side of the road, leaking lung fluid, But it's not because it's impossible to run a marathon. It's because it's impossible for you now as you are.
Right.
So how do you run a marathon? You don't try really hard. You train really hard. I've done races before. You start at 1 mile a day. You go run 1 mile, and then you rest. And then, the basic model is every week you add 1 mile on to your long run. So week 2, your long run is 2 miles. Week 3 is 3 miles. Normally every 3 weeks you pause. So then you take a week off, and then week 5, I guess it would be, is 3 miles again, then 4, then 5, then a week off, then 6, then 7, then 8, then a week off, then 8, then 9, then 10. And over months and months and months of training, you become the kind of person for whom running 26.2 miles is hard. It will always be hard. A marathon is easy for no one, but it is within your capacity as a person.
Wow.
The problem is almost nobody approaches discipleship this way. So imagine if you were to approach lust or anxiety or greed.
I will never lust again.
Like the way,
good luck with that.
Yeah, I'm going to try really hard. I just heard a sermon on lust. I'm going to work really hard to not look at porn this week. that is just a losing strategy because it's based on willpower. And you can use all sorts of theological language about how it's God and not you, but at the end of the day, you're really asking your willpower to do something that it's not strong enough to do. Now, this analogy breaks down because I don't think that spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation are just the spiritual equivalent of fart lickers or whatever, like running, sprint marathon workouts or whatever. Because these are not just habits. These are habits that make space for the Spirit of God. So this is where they're not less than habits. When people want to say the spiritual disciplines don't do anything, that's patently untrue. Everything we do does something to us. Mm-hmm. So if I watch TV, if I read poetry, if I go exercise, it's doing something. That habit, good or bad, it's doing something to me. Prayer, Sabbath, scripture, community, they do something to me. But they ultimately cannot transform me into a person of Christ-like character. They can do good things to my nervous system. They can calm me down. They can make me more patient, more self-aware. But the deep transformation, all they can really do is it's back to what I said earlier, opening up a deeper part of myself to grace, opening up a deeper layer of me to the power and the presence of God to do what no habit stacking, God bless James Clear, I love that book, but none of that ever can do to actually transform me into a person of love.
Last question for you.
Yeah.
You're pulling yourself off the road. No more speaking.
The road. I love that you made me sound like a rock star.
The whole entourage is being retired, right? But you're no more travel speaking, no more speaking. What's behind that decision?
Short version, I feel that's the right step for me. I have 3 teenage kids that I'm never going to get these next couple of years back. I have 1 more year with my oldest and 4 more years with our other 2. I'm never going to get these years back. But I also think in the digital age, I don't think the digital age is all bad. I think it's mostly bad, but I think there's some really great things that we can utilize for it. And I'm not personally a big believer in using the digital technology for community, but I do think it's a good delivery vehicle for teaching and training and some early stage kind of knowledge-based education. So we live in this beautiful world where I can live more deeply than ever and share more widely than ever. And so, there's that old saying, my dad used to say this to me, you are responsible for the depth of your ministry. God is responsible for the breadth of your ministry. A little cheesy, but beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I think going forward, I would like to live a small, quiet life. I'd like to start a little community. We want to start like a monastic order, basically. I want to do life around tables. I have some serious stuff in my marriage, in my husbanding that I just need Jesus to heal. And I want to live smallly. I want to live locally. I want to live slowly. I want to live deeply. And then I can write books and I can preach some stuff and put it on the internet. If it's helpful to people, wonderful. And I'm not saying that all pastors should do that. I have no judgment at all of people that travel and speak. I'm just saying for me, I don't feel that's my primary call. And I think if I can live deeply, I think that's part of the pastoral call. Like we're all trying to figure out, how do you follow Jesus in the digital age? We're in LA. How do I follow Jesus and raise kids in a city this sexualized, this secular, this, liberal, this lost, this pluralistic? These are great questions to devote time and energy to.
I love it. Well, look who's here.
Look here, the non-perfectionist dog that we lost.
Who's this?
This is Jen Urso.
Wow.
Sorry, she just interrupted our podcast.
That's all right. It's a good place to wrap up. Yes. We were at time anyway. The book is called Practicing the Way. I would encourage, it's going to be a reread for me. And it's a beautiful book. It's just beautifully put together, so clear. And it gave me hope. Gave me hope for the next 20 years. This is not as good as it gets.
Yeah.
And much more is possible. Any final word or thought or call to action for listeners?
I just think of that line. It's not original to me. You must find the goodness of God in your actual life. Yeah. Wherever you're at, whatever stage of the journey you're on, whether you're a pastor or not a pastor, or used to be a pastor or not sure what a pastor is, may you find the goodness of God in your actual life.
Thanks, John Mark.
Thanks, Carey.